the dark truth about how borders drawn in 1916 are still causing wars today. Imagine two men sitting in a room with a map spread out in front of them. They have never visited the land they are about to divide. They do not speak the languages of the people who live there. They do not know the tribes, the faiths, the histories, or the blood feuds that stretch back 1,000 years. But they have pens, and they have power. In the spring of 1916, a British diplomat named Mark Sykes and a French diplomat named François-Georges Picot drew a line across the Middle East, a line that cut through families, through communities, through ancient civilizations. A line that 110 years later is still soaked in blood. This is the story of how two men with a ruler changed the world forever, and why the world is still paying for it today. To understand why 1916 matters, you need to understand what the world looked like before it. For over 600 years, the Middle East had been ruled by the Ottoman Empire. It was vast, it was ancient, and by the early 20th century, it was dying. The Ottomans had allied themselves with Germany in World War I, and it was becoming clear they were on the losing side. Britain and France, the two dominant colonial powers of the era, began making plans, not to liberate the people of the Middle East, not to support their right to self-determination, but to carve up the region between themselves, like slicing a cake they had not baked. The man Britain sent to negotiate this carve-up was Sir Mark Sykes. He was a politician, a traveler, a man who considered himself an expert on the East. He was, by most accounts, charming, confident, and completely wrong about almost everything important. The man France sent was François-Georges Picot, a diplomat, a career bureaucrat, a man who believed, as most Europeans did at the time, that colonial rule was not only natural, but beneficial. Together, they negotiated the Sykes-Picot Agreement, a secret deal signed in May 1916 that would determine the fate of millions of people who had no idea it was happening. The agreement divided the Arab lands of the crumbling Ottoman Empire into spheres of influence. Britain would control what is today Iraq, Jordan, and parts of Palestine. France would control what is today Syria and Lebanon. The rest would be administered jointly or handed to newly created client states. The people who lived in these lands were not consulted. They were not informed. They were simply drawn around. If you want to understand the human cost of what Sykes and Picot did, start with the Kurds. The Kurds are one of the oldest ethnic groups in the Middle East. They number somewhere between 30 and 40 million people today. They have their own language, their own culture, their own history stretching back thousands of years. They do not have their own country. The Sykes-Picot Agreement and the subsequent treaties that followed World War I split the Kurdish homeland across 4 countries: Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran. In none of these countries are Kurds the majority. In most of them, they have faced persecution, suppression, and violence for generations. In Turkey, the Kurdish language was banned for decades. Kurdish identity was officially denied. To be Kurdish was, for much of the 20th century, to be invisible. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein launched the Anfal campaign in the late 1980s. Chemical weapons were used against Kurdish villages. Tens of thousands of Kurds were killed. The world mostly looked away. In Syria, Kurds were denied citizenship for decades, stripped of the right to own property, forbidden from teaching their language in schools. And through all of this, the Kurds have fought. In Turkey, the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, has waged a decades-long armed struggle. In Iraq, the Peshmerga have battled Saddam, then ISIS, then political rivals in Baghdad. In Syria, Kurdish forces became the primary ground army against the Islamic State and were then abandoned by their allies the moment the fighting was done. Every one of these conflicts, every one of these wars, traces a direct line back to 1916, back to two men in a room with a pen and a map. Now let us talk about Iraq. The country we call Iraq today did not exist before the British drew its borders. What existed were three Ottoman provinces: Mosul in the north, Baghdad in the center, and Basra in the south. They had different populations, different economies, different social structures, and in many cases, deep mutual suspicion. Mosul was predominantly Kurdish and Turkmen. Baghdad was the heartland of Sunni Arab power. Basra was dominated by Shia Arabs. Britain stitched them together into a single country and installed a Hashemite king named Faisal, who had no roots in the region, to rule it. The British told themselves this would work. It would not. The only way to hold Iraq together, as history would prove over and over again, was force. Brutal, systematic, merciless force. The British used it. The early Iraqi governments used it. And eventually, Saddam Hussein used it on a scale that shocked the world. Saddam was a monster. Let us be clear about that. But he was also, in a grim and terrible way, the inevitable product of an impossible geography. You cannot hold together a country that was never meant to be a country without becoming a monster. The borders demanded it. When the United States invaded Iraq in 2003 and removed Saddam, they did not just remove a dictator. They removed the only force that had been keeping the seams of 1916 from tearing open. Within years, those seams did tear. The Shia majority, long suppressed, moved to consolidate power in Baghdad. The Sunni minority, stripped of their status and livelihoods, became radicalized. And from that radicalization rose the Islamic State. ISIS. The black flag of ISIS flew over Mosul, the same city the British had drawn into Iraq almost a century before, partly for its oil. The fighters who marched under that flag had many motivations, but one of them, at the root, was a profound and correct sense that the borders under which they lived had been imposed upon them by outsiders who did not care whether they lived or died. Sykes-Picot did not create ISIS, but without Sykes-Picot, ISIS, at least as it existed, would not have been possible. If Iraq is the story of borders failing slowly, Syria is the story of borders failing catastrophically. The French took control of what is now Syria after World War I, and they were strategic about it. Deliberately, cynically strategic. France governed Syria by exploiting its divisions. They elevated the Alawite minority, a small sect of Islam to which Bashar al-Assad belongs, to positions of power in the military and security services. They kept the Sunni majority in the interior politically marginalized. They created Lebanon as a separate country, drawing borders that concentrated Christians in a coastal region where France had close ties. The logic was colonial and simple. Divided people do not unite against their rulers. But France eventually left, and the divisions it had deepened and weaponized remained. When the Arab Spring arrived in 2011 and Syrians took to the streets demanding dignity and reform, Assad responded with guns. And the country did not just fracture, it fractured along the exact lines the French had drawn and deepened a century before. Alawites versus Sunnis, coast versus interior, regime versus everyone else. Kurds fighting for autonomy in the northeast, jihadist groups filling the vacuum in the northwest. Foreign powers, Russia, Iran, Turkey, the United States, all pouring weapons into a country that had been artificially assembled from pieces that were never meant to fit. More than 500,000 people have been killed in the Syrian Civil War. More than 12 million people have been displaced. Half the population of Syria left their homes. The largest refugee crisis since World War II began, in large part, because of a map drawn in 1916. Here is the thing that should keep you up at night. Sykes-Picot was not unique. It was a template. In 1884 and 1885, the major European powers gathered in Berlin. Not a single African leader was invited. The Berlin Conference, as it became known, was essentially a real estate meeting. The European powers divided up the entire continent of Africa between themselves. They drew lines based on rivers, mountain ranges, and in many cases nothing more than a ruler held against a blank piece of paper. By the time the European colonizers left Africa in the 1950s and 1960s, they had created a continent of countries with artificial borders, countries that lumped together dozens of ethnic groups who had spent centuries as rivals, countries that split single ethnic groups across multiple borders, countries designed to be administered, not to be nations. The wars that followed independence in Africa were not simply the result of African failure. They were the result of European design. The Civil War in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the genocide in Rwanda, where colonial powers had deliberately elevated one ethnic group over another and handed them identity cards labeling them as different races. The conflict in South Sudan, the instability of the Sahel, the war in Ethiopia between the central government and the Tigray region. All of these conflicts have their own specific histories, their own specific grievances. It would be wrong to reduce them entirely to colonial borders.
But all of them are made worse, and many of them were made possible by the borders European empires drew without asking the people inside them. The year 1916 is one data point in a much larger catastrophe of imperial cartography. A catastrophe whose cost is still being paid in blood today. At this point, you might be asking a reasonable question. If these borders are so bad, why not just redraw them? The answer is both simple and devastating. The international system, the rules that govern how countries interact, is built on one foundational principle above almost all others: the sanctity of state borders. Once a country is recognized, its borders are considered inviolable. Change one, and you create a precedent. Change one, and every government in the world that has minority groups within its borders, which is almost every government in the world, begins to panic, Turkey will not allow a Kurdish state to form on its southern border because it fears its own Kurdish population would demand the same. Iran will not allow it for the same reason. Iraq and Syria would fragment completely if the Kurds got independence. Every country in Africa knows that if the borders of one country can be redrawn, then any border can be redrawn. The possibility of secession, of fragmentation, is an existential threat to governments that rule over dozens of different ethnic groups. And so the borders of 1916 are locked in place, not because they are just, not because they reflect the will of the people inside them, but because changing them would risk chaos even greater than the chaos they currently produce. There have been exceptions. South Sudan became independent from Sudan in 2011. Kosovo declared independence from Serbia in 2008. But both examples demonstrate the problem. South Sudan descended almost immediately into its own civil war. Kosovo's independence is still contested by dozens of countries. Redrawing the map is not a solution, but keeping the map is not a solution either. The people living inside these lines are trapped in a problem that has no clean answer. Let us return for a moment to the men themselves. Mark Sykes was 36 years old when he negotiated the agreement that bears his name. He considered himself a friend of the Arab people. He had traveled extensively in the region. He wrote books about it. He genuinely believed, in the way that colonizers often genuinely believe, that he was helping. He died in 1919 of the Spanish flu at the Paris Peace Conference. He never saw what his line would become. He was 39 years old. François-Georges Picot lived until 1951. He watched the region he helped shape descend into conflict, war, and revolution across the decades. There is no record of him ever expressing regret about the agreement. Neither man was a cartoon villain. Neither man sat in that room twirling a mustache and laughing about the suffering they would cause. They were products of their time, their class, and their empire. They believed what colonizers believed, that the people of the Middle East were not capable of governing themselves, and that European supervision was therefore a gift, not a theft. They were wrong. Catastrophically, generationally, irreversibly wrong. And the gap between the confidence with which they drew those lines and the reality of what those lines produced is one of the most instructive lessons history has to offer. Certainty without knowledge, power without accountability, decisions made for millions by men who had never met them. That is how empires work, and that is why empires end. We live in a world that was designed by people who are long dead. We inherit borders, laws, institutions, and conflicts that were built by hands we will never shake, in rooms we will never see, for reasons that often had nothing to do with our welfare. That is not an excuse for helplessness. It is a call for understanding. When you see a news headline about violence in Iraq, or war in Syria, or conflict between Kurdish fighters and the Turkish military, or refugee crises that seem to have no end, you are not seeing random chaos. You are seeing the bill come due on decisions made in 1916. The question is not who to blame. Blame, at this point, is almost beside the point. The question is what we do with this knowledge. We can start by listening to the people inside those borders, by understanding that the nations of the Middle East and Africa are not ancient primordial bloodbaths. They are, in many cases, artificial constructs imposed by outsiders, and the people within them have been doing remarkable things to build identity, community, and meaning in spite of those constructs.
We can resist the temptation to send in more outside powers with more confident plans for other people's lives. History has a verdict on how that tends to go. And we can remember the lesson of two men in a room with a pen and a map. The decisions made by the powerful do not stay in that room. They travel outward, across generations, across oceans. They become the landscape that ordinary people are born into, live inside, and sometimes die because of. Power is not just an event. It is an inheritance. And the people of the Middle East and of Africa, and of every region carved up by colonial hands, are still inheriting it today. Thank you for watching. If this video made you think differently about the world you live in, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to go deeper, the links below are a starting point. The history is long, the stakes are real, and understanding it matters.